everyone. My name is Kaitlyn Herndon, and today I'm going to be talking to you about nightmares. But since nightmares are something pretty personal and admittedly kind of embarrassing, I'm going to extend to you all an olive branch by starting with some of mine. I'm afraid of everything. Heights, the dark, needles, spiders, bird scooters, night swimming, and basically my own shadow. It's not the best. My operative emotion is probably a healthy dose of fear, but I love a good scary movie. And that's for two reasons. One, the bad ones are really funny. And two, the good ones have made me a better person. Now, I understand that that's admittedly a tougher point. A better person? How does spending 2 hours watching terrible things happen to complete strangers make you a better person? Here's my answer. It's about recognizing and validating empathy. But this cannot just be a conversation about me and my odd assortment of fears. It's also a conversation about you all and what you're afraid of, how fear operates in a horror movie, and how it rears its ugly head as a dominant emotion in the human experience. So, I would like everyone in the room to concentrate on something they're afraid of, even if you're not sure why. Try to keep it low stakes, like clowns, dolls, dark basements. Now, we're going to take it a step further. I want everyone to focus on something that terrifies them, whether it's a little abstract or in the distant future. Maybe that's failure, change, losing a loved one. The importance of this exercise is for each of us to realize we have different kinds of fears, each posing a different level threat to our happiness. Group 1 fears are the kind that you see integrated in a scary movie. For example, 2 hours of a killer clown. Group 2 fears feel a little too sensitive for film. They represent something primally important to us, and therefore we'd like to keep them off limits. But the beauty of the genre, and actually possibly the worst thing, is that horror combines Group 1 and Group 2 fears, tying a small one, like being home alone on a dark and stormy night, to a bigger one, sudden alienation, a fear of solitude. Horror is constantly evolving to understand and portray new kinds of fears, forcing us to become a little bit more intimate with deep-rooted nightmares that are far more personal than just being a little nervous in the dark. And so, scary movies act as a psychological entry point so that we can encourage intimacy, vulnerability, and common humanity through the shared experience of fear. Fear, disgust, and revulsion are not a new concept in life or in art. Countless cultures have spent centuries using the shock value of fear to convey important messages, whether it be following the respects of a religion or confirming societal dogma. But the origin of horror is almost exactly what you'd expect, a multiplicitous monster popping up in various locations and traditions. Horror movies first got their start in the late 1800s and early 1900s, coming from places like Germany, Japan, Italy, the US, and others. They were often called trick films, using photographic technology to mimic what we're afraid of. For example, when X-ray technology first became available to the public, directors shot films through the machinery so that people could see moving skeletons for the very first time. And lucky for horror, everyone hated that. At the beginning, this was how the genre operated. It was all about gimmicks, tricking you into being afraid of the thing lurking outside. It was sudden suspenseful music, a rustling outside of the window, something played in minor key over here, and jump scares. Because horror movies successfully stay with us if they can surprise us and somehow defy our expectations. Nice, a nice touch. In order for me to do this conversation justice, I have to refer to one of my greatest heroes, Stephen King. He talks about the 3 kinds of terror: the gross out, the sight of a severed head tumbling down a flight of stairs. It's when the lights go out and something green and slimy splatters against your arm. The horror, the unnatural, spiders the size of bears, the dead waking up and walking around. It's when the lights go out and something with claws grabs you by the arm. And the last and worst one, terror. It's when you get home and realize everything you own had been taken away and replaced by an exact substitute. It's when the lights go out and you feel something behind you. You hear it. You feel its breath against your ear. But when you turn around, there's nothing there. So with these distinctions in mind, it's actually possible to break down our understanding of horror into something a little bit easier to grasp. When we think gross out, we think slasher or body horror. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the later iterations of the Saw franchise. These movies love grotesqueness and revulsion, but the fear comes from a violation of the body, degradation of autonomy over one's physical bounds. The next category is horror. What King calls the unnatural might be a little bit more familiar to us as the supernatural. So the fear of a movie like Insidious or The Conjuring is in having the firmly grasped understandings of your universe tested in often aggressive and malevolent ways. For example, Casper the Friendly Ghost might challenge your understanding of the universe, but he's not exactly emblematic of horror. A 9-foot demon with spindly, pencil-thin fingers, a dislocated jaw, and long, cavernous eye sockets leaking tar, yeah, that's horror. So now we can move to our final category, terror, which might be most distinctly related to psychological horror. Even still, it's a genre that's difficult to navigate because the paranoia and anxiety it inspires often mimics our understanding of thriller, mystery, and action. These are movies like Silence of the Lambs or Don't Breathe, TV shows like Black Mirror. The fear comes from the fact that these situations feel feasible. They speak to a fear of reality and a fear of one another. But it's ironic because even if a psychological horror film could convince you to be afraid of the people to your right and to your left, we still watch most scary movies in the company of others. Long gone are the days when we had to go to a theater to see a film. We don't even need to rely on DVD and VHS. Friday night blockbuster runs have become something of a relic. So it's fascinating that we could have The Shining at our literal fingertips in seconds, and yet most of us would still hesitate to click play for the only one in the room. That hesitancy isn't unlike how watching a comedy alone feels a little less fun. The jokes just don't land. Or when you're halfway through a heart-wrenching drama by yourself and it just feels hollow. There's something missing when you're consuming art by yourself. So it's a good thing we watch scary movies in the company of others, because watching and consuming story content with other people expands the conversation beyond the limits of one person's mind. And let's face it, you feel a lot better watching grisly murders and demonic possession when you're cozy on a couch in between people you like, and preferably when your least favorite friend is blocking the door. But that's okay, because all of this just speaks to the way we as a species choose to process fear. We prefer to do it together. And that makes a lot of sense and also has key implications for the way horror as a genre is forced to operate, meaning that it's had to revolutionize over and over again in order to survive. If we stayed always in the early days of directors like Benjamin Christensen, we'd pretty much only have movies about devils and spiders. And eventually, we'd stop being quite so afraid of those things. Because one of fear's greatest enemies is normalcy. And therefore, one of horror's greatest enemies is stagnancy. And as a result, the genre itself has become sort of a metafictional diatribe on adapt or die. Variety in the genre, variety that's actually reflective of 21st century worries and concerns, contributes to versatility, scaring more people, making more money, and ensuring the longevity of the art form. And the results are tangible. According to Box Office Mojo, in 2017 alone, horror made $733 million. Clearly, there's no shortage of masochists and adrenaline junkies thirsting for horror content. But there's also no shortage of anti-fear content as well. Plenty of people have been traumatized by the genre, carrying around random fears from their childhood. We all have at least one friend that remains adamant they will never ever watch a scary movie, even when they lose the vote every time. But that initial gut reaction is part of the point. Horror's MO is that scaring more people successfully means impacting more people. And that kind of exponential reach is paramount, because any art that's able to put itself in conversation with a lot of humans can effectuate change. And now that can move me to my most controversial statement of today, somehow, which is that horror is becoming an inherently good thing. Try that on for size. We're starting to see a new kind of fear content, one that's becoming more self-aware. And the first time that we're seeing this is with our protagonists. Once the source material for bad jokes about questionable decision-making, answering the door, splitting up the group, yelling "who's there" into the cavernous dark basement, expecting a response. We now have protagonists that are actual models for perseverance and ingenuity. We see them in dark times doing the best they can to get up when the plot just keeps kicking them down. And so yes, for the first time ever, with each new and improved horror movie that comes to a screen near you, We're getting characters that are less helpless and less unsure of themselves. When the going gets tough, you should just get a bigger knife. And this is spreading to our understanding of women in horror as well, and thank God for that. Because in the 1970s and 80s, all horror actresses were couched under the label scream queens, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. And as the term evolved to include people that actually had a more tangible will to live, the genre as a whole started leaning into a new definition, Carol J. Clover's understanding of the final girl. This term itself would undergo various revolutions until it finally turned into what we know it as today, a woman who would weather the storm and win. Adrienne King, Lupita Nyong'o, Kate Siegel. We're seeing women in film that are attacking their problems. They're coming back with everything that they have. And it's massively important to our understanding of the female reclamation narrative in horror as well. We're getting meditations on sex, pushing timely critiques of slut-shaming, dismantling power dynamics in slasher. For the first time in a genre that once expected women to be beautiful and die, we are getting empowered female characters saving themselves from doom and destruction. And this means a lot to our understanding of how horror understands humanity and how we understand our humanity. It's not surprising that watching a horror film asks you to do a lot of work. You're suspending your disbelief, trying to avoid biting your nails, and now you're situating yourself in a world characterized by anarchy and confusion. And when watching a well-made film, what director David Robert Mitchell would call smart horror, there are no apologies and there is no sugarcoating, which is huge, because for the first time, our storytelling doesn't need to sweep things under the rug. Mental illness is not overlooked, pain is not outfitted as a cheap plot device, loss is not forgotten about. In horror storytelling, there is no time for that. Because I would argue that it's not entirely off base that sometimes when we go to the movies, we're not looking for a superhero. We're looking for an underdog, someone who represents the most desperate parts of ourselves, the worst parts. And if that's what we want, then horror delivers. For example, The Blair Witch Project, a seminal work in found footage horror. 3 main characters in the woods of Maryland going crazy minute after minute. And they're not even written to be particularly likable people. So we have trouble empathizing with them. But the film's release was paramount because they told every single person with every ad and promo, hey, guess what? This all actually happened. Don't you want to see what it looked like out there? On the International Movie Database, the 3 main actors were listed as deceased for a significant amount of time after the film's release, and that's crazy. Because if you go see The Blair Witch Project, thinking the entire time that it's real, are you not just watching a tragedy? If, for just a second, you could actually suspend your disbelief for any character in a horror movie and believe they had a family or a bucket list, a secret desire, you would just be learning of a personal horror story, a nightmare come to life. And for the first time, it feels like we are living in a world in which King is right. The dead are waking up and walking around, and our worst nightmares are coming to pass. Or maybe it's just that movies are doing a better job of showing us what that looks like. But regardless, the last decade has been 10 years of newer, weirder, and scarier horror. Oscar award-winning Jordan Peele's Get Out and Us have forced us to take a good hard look at the political order and run screaming. Mastermind Ari Aster's Midsummer and Hereditary are asking us to play voyeuristic witness to tense family dynamics. Conversation starters like 10 Cloverfield Lane and Bird Box are putting us in a position where humans are no longer the apex predator. So where does that leave us? I would argue that that leaves us more vulnerable, because for the first time, our horror viewership is asking us to be more afraid of the real things than the surrogates. But that's okay to be in a position where we can look past the clowns and witches and dolls to an underlying situation. We see more to fear in climate change than a CGI monster, and family tragedy than the hypothetical cult, and the myth of freedom than a red jumpsuit doppelganger. This isn't because we've outgrown our group 1 fears. I'm still afraid of the monsters under my bed. I'm just also acknowledging the ones that could be waiting outside my front door. And horror is making that jump with us. Because for the first time in a genre in film, we're being asked to expose the bare bones of our worries. And it's giving us a mutually assured platform of fear in which we can work harder to understand one another's humanity. So I would ask you, next time you're flipping through Netflix or Hulu, to consider this reframing. you don't really dislike all horror movies, and you don't hate the genre. You're just afraid of knowing exactly what it is that scares you and seeing it for what it is. But that puts you in a position of power to work hard to eradicate the things you can control, the things you've left undone, the things you've left unsaid. So embrace your fear. Give yourself the freedom and the room to understand and talk about it, and use it as motivation to work towards a world in which you don't have to be afraid, in which horror is just a genre and not a reality. So thank you all for your time, and sweet dreams, everyone.